Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Festival of Ideas. My name is Lawrence Black. I'm a Professor of Modern History here at the University of York. I wanted to say one other quick thing before I introduce Sam to us, which was just to acknowledge the ongoing UKU campaign on pay conditions and precarity at York, as well as at all other UK universities. There is an industrial dispute at the moment. So if you're enjoying the brilliance of the Festival of Ideas, please do remember that there is also a difficult situation where some staff are being told they're going to lose 50% of their pay. And I thought it would be remiss of me not to note that. It's not just York, it's all UK universities. It's a great pleasure to welcome Sam Bright to the festival and back to York, where he was an undergraduate, graduating in 2015 with a first-class degree in history. Sam is a current affairs writer and editor who has written for national and international titles, including the New York Times, the BBC, and the New Statesman. He is the author of Fortress London, Why We Need to Save the Country from Its Capital, and of the book that he's going to talk about this evening, Bullingdon Club Britain, The Ransacking of a Nation. So welcome back, Sam, and the floor is all yours, and hopefully we'll get some good questions for afterwards.
Thanks, Lawrence, and it's a real pleasure to be back, if only virtually. Hopefully at one of these festivals in future I'll be able to join in person. I have to say, a bit of housekeeping on my front as well, that Lawrence was my lecturer at York, and so he's the example that I follow. So if the following isn't up to scratch, then please blame him and not me. As has been introduced, my new book is called Bullingdon Club Britain, The Ransacking of a Nation. And I think the natural place to start is for those who are uninitiated, so to speak, by answering the question, what is the Bullingdon Club? So to put it in its most basic terms, the Bullingdon Club is a socially exclusive society at the University of Oxford, open only to the male alumni of Britain's most expensive private schools, the names that we all know and love: Eton, Westminster, Harrow, St Paul's, etc. As the New York Times wrote in 1913, it is the club of the sons of nobility, the sons of great wealth. Its membership represents the young bloods of the university. Though it was founded primarily as a cricket club, like every good cricket club, it is now essentially a drinking society. And it's best known for its elitism and its debauchery. An instructive tale is told by John Mitchinson, a former Bullingdon Club member, in the introduction to my book, and I'm very grateful to John for having written the introduction. There are rules of secrecy around the Bullingdon Club, which John broke, and it was quite courageous of him to do so. So John joined the Buller, as it's known, in the 1980s, the same generation as the likes of David Cameron, Boris Johnson, etc. And he reckons that he was the only state-schooled member in its roughly 200-year history. He writes that his flirtation with the Bullingdon Club ended after several months, when he and his fiancée got in a spot of bother at an Oxford bar. A fellow member of the club had joined them at John's table, emptied their jug of port, and refilled it with his own urine. This Bullingdon Club member sent the jug back to the waitress, saying that the port was off. John decided to end his association with the club after that incident, which is quite instructive, I think, of the nature of the society. A former Bullingdon Club membership scout told the Observer a few years ago that every time someone was elected, they had their rooms smashed to pieces, saying that Bullingdon members had an air of entitlement and superiority. And John himself tells the story of his own initiation ritual in the introduction. The scout went on to say that the whole culture was to get extremely drunk and exert vandalism. People talk about the Bullingdon Club trashing places, but it was serious criminal damage. This perhaps wouldn't be quite so worrying if the Bullingdon Club didn't operate as a finishing school for our current political class. The investigative journalist Tom Much, in an article for the Daily Beast, which I recommend that you read, says that over the 50-year period, during a 50-year period during the 20th century, the club's alumni included a prime minister, a chancellor, 3 foreign secretaries, 5 first lords of the Admiralty, some 50 members of parliament, and more than 100 peers of the realm. Much reports that even in 1894, the Bullingdon Club was ordered not to hold any meetings within 15 miles of central Oxford after smashing all 534 windows in Peckwater, a quad in the university's Christchurch College. Not much has changed there then. The Bullingdon Club's influence is so pervasive that one of its annual photos has almost entirely been scrubbed from the internet, featuring 2 lofty-looking future prime ministers, Boris Johnson and David Cameron. Not featured in this photo was George Osborne, who was a contemporary of Johnson and Cameron in the Bullingdon Club, and of course became the latter's chancellor and neighbour in Downing Street. The bond between the club's alumni is strong as well, so strong that Johnson apparently still chants "Buller, Buller, Buller" when he greets his delinquents in arms when meeting them in later life. So the thesis of my book, the essential proposition, is that our institutions of power continue to be populated by individuals who are drawn from privilege and who have perpetuated a politics of destructive elitism, a similar sort of destructive elitism as is practiced itself in the Bullingdon Club. Oxford was a playground for Johnson and his contemporaries in the 1980s. Their enjoyment was derived from the vandalism of both people and of property. The ruling elite in the present day, which includes but is not confined to former Bullingdon boys, is now ransacking Britain. As John Mitchinson says, the Bullingdon Club I joined was a purpose-free institution where lies went unpunished and a large stack of cash could always be summoned to make problems go away. It had a brazen and amoral quality that felt strange to me back then. Now, though, it's the reality we all live in. If we look at current political circumstances, economic growth has stalled, wealth inequalities have widened, working life has become more precarious, and identity-based divisions have festered. But in the UK and elsewhere, governing parties have insisted that others are to blame, typically immigrants and nebulous liberal woke agitators. This, frankly, terrible state of affairs is intimately linked to the character of our political establishment, Yes, we are ruled by a new elite, even if it's not the one conceived by Matthew Goodwin. There has been a rule of British politics for centuries, and I think it was epitomised by what George Orwell wrote in The Lion and the Unicorn in 1941. England is the most class-ridden country under the sun. It is a land of snobbery and privilege, ruled largely by the old and silly. But the fact is that silliness has been overtaken by a destructive, self-interested impulse among our leaders. Our new elite combines snobbery with yobbery. Those in positions of privilege use their power not to protect and serve in a paternalistic fashion, but rather to urinate in our port and get away with it. It's clear, I think, to people on all sides of the political spectrum that something has intensified in recent years. The number of political scandals hitting the headlines has multiplied while their scale has enlarged. To me, it seems a narrow subsection of the population is entrenching its wealth and power, while the economy is flatlining or even being sent in reverse for the vast majority of Brits. No longer is the British class system softened by the universal growth in living standards experienced in the post-war age of affluence. Taking inflation into account, real disposable incomes doubled in Britain from 1950 to 1970. In the 2010s, by contrast, living standards in the UK grew at their slowest rate since the Second World War. At the same time, our political culture seems to be meaner and more deceitful than ever before. Falsehoods are rampant, guided into the ears of the public by a political and media class that has certainly lost its sense of public duty and perhaps even its handle on basic reality. To many of our politicians, the ones who have jumped on the conveyor belts leading from an elite private school to Oxbridge and then to Parliament, democracy is simply a game, or at least it seems that way. Whether a former Bullingdon Club member or not, they seem to have no real concept of the harm they can and have caused. Politics for them is stuck in that moment when they stood up to make their first Oxford Union address, their pals lurking in the wings, poised to plant sensational rumours about their opponents in the student rag. This game is facilitated by our modern information age. The relentless noise of the internet and our dwindling collective attention span is the perfect terrain for spin and misinformation to germinate. And this has been exploited by the sons and daughters of privilege who form the Bullingdon Club elite. Indeed, we trust the Bullingdon Club elite, not because what they say is true, but because they have been taught how to massage the truth in a way that sounds convincing. As Johnson himself admitted at a Latin-themed charity event in 2007, the thing about Latinate words is they're evasive. In an era when there is too much information to consume, we increasingly rely on our feelings about a politician, feelings that are heavily guided by social conditioning. And the pandemic epitomized this current political climate, showing how an old boys club still predominates to the detriment often of the collective good. Contrary to the official line, Britain was not in a state of readiness for the pandemic, wrote George Arbuthnot and Jonathan Calvert in Failures of State. Emergency stockpiles of PPE had severely dwindled and were out of date because they had become a low priority in the years of austerity cuts. And when the crisis arrived, the governing party acted more like a social club for the rich, a frat house for corporate interests, than a democratic body. More than £3 billion worth of COVID contracts were awarded to firms, often without competition, owned by conservative donors and associates. As Junior Health Minister Lord James Bethell, whose WhatsApp messages mysteriously disappeared, himself admitted, we relied on a very large network of contacts and informal arrangements in order to reach the people who could manufacture, often moving their manufacturing from one product to another. So, in other words, ministers reached for their phone books and called their pals, institutionalizing the now notorious VIP system that was both wasteful and undemocratic. In total, on top of the £3 billion that went to Tory mates, the government has written off £9 billion worth of PPE that is unusable, has passed its expiry date, or was procured at highly inflated prices. The UK's international aid budget, by comparison to that £9 billion, was a total of £11 billion in 2021. And aside from party donors, which rightfully has got a lot of attention during the pandemic, the proceeds of this period were harvested by big outsourcing firms that have steadily captured parts of the state for the past 20 years. The consultancy giant Deloitte, for example, was paid a whopping £2 million a day to supply 2,000 staff to the test and trace programme, essentially acting as a supplicant for the civil service. Two of the biggest winners of COVID contracts were Serco and G4S, which, despite repeated controversies, continue to win billions of pounds worth of government contracts on an annual basis. In terms of how this fits into the ideological framework of what I'm talking about, I think this shows how far the Conservative Party has strayed from the free market principles of Margaret Thatcher. Rather than empowering agile, innovative firms, the government shoveled contracts to billion-pound corporations with a talent, above all else, for procuring government contracts. As Mark Fisher describes in Capitalist Realism, these firms are at the apex of what he calls market Stalinism. These corporate giants suffer from the same bureaucracy as the state, but are less transparent. They're not accountable to the public. And crucially, they're much better at PR. It's, I think, a pretty widely held fact, even on the right of modern British politics, that our public services that are crumbling everywhere you look are run by private firms that we did not vote for and cannot interrogate either via a press conference or a freedom of information request. This is market Stalinism. Monopolies plagued by bureaucracy and low productivity, enabled to win public contracts thanks to their political connections and protected by a business-friendly environment that keeps taxes low and unions marginalized. Don't take my word for it, but just listen to these words from Maurice Sacchi, who helped to run Thatcher's marketing campaigns in the 1980s. He says that the Iron Lady would have hated the outcome of her own free market ideals. This concentration of power, he said, in a few companies is the opposite of what she would have wanted for the free market. She thought that from competition would come better quality and more variety, but it hasn't worked out that way. Most industries are now global cartels. Customers have become irrelevant. Big companies like Facebook and Google are worse than big government. They have no accountability. It's so disappointing. That's Saatchi saying that. And that for me is the sort of economics behind the Bullingdon Club mentality, a form of elitism that benefits a few shareholders and donors, party insiders, at the expense of consumers and workers and the public at large. So, question remains, where does this mentality come from? Well, we probably should look at the schools that churn out our aspiring world kings. This was famously Boris Johnson's life ambition, which he expressed at a relatively young age. And even at school, he saw how this ambition was linked to his expensive education. Writing for The Chronicle, Eton's student magazine, aged just 16, Johnson said, "Strain every nerve, parents of Britain, to send your son to this educational establishment. Exercise your freedom of choice, because in this way you will imbue your son with the most important thing, a sense of his own importance." For 9 of the last 13 years, we have been governed by individuals with that self-importance who have graduated from Eton College. And Cameron and Johnson weren't one-offs, but they signify a renaissance of the British aristocracy in politics and in business as well. The meritocratic ideals embodied by Thatcher, the daughter of a grocery shop owner, and John Major, who left school at 16 with 3 O-levels, have been wiped from our latest breed of political leaders. The march of the meritocracy has been halted, and in some respects has even been sent catapulting in reverse. As Mark Carnegie said, Johnson's main opponent for his second run at the Oxford Union presidency, it became clear to me how powerful Eton is as a manufacturer of cultural capital. It's disproportionately powerful, devastatingly so. It's like the Golden Sachs of England, but instead of financial capture, it has national capture. So, despite the language of meritocracy that has pervaded modern politics, there has been an enduring sycophancy towards the likes of Johnson and his brand of idle genius. Just think of it, a working class person at the dispatch box, ruffled hair, baggy suit, slurred speech. They could never have got away with it. Whereas Boris Johnson has made that very nature, he's made that central to his wildly successful political brand, or at least wildly successful until last year. I mean, it could be even argued that a sense of entitled self-assurance is essential to the modern politician. If you think about it, in an era when politicians are under the microscope, subjected to daily scandals and needing to persuade a skeptical, apathetic population of their ability to lead, surely a dogmatic certainty in one's own ability is vital to ensure that you stay at the top. And aside from delivering good grades, private schools are valuable because they educate students about systems, the ways to navigate the modern world, to enhance your power and wealth. Graduates are also endowed with the social manners of the elite, allowing them to assimilate easily into high society if they weren't otherwise born into it. Johnson has perhaps hyperbolically described POP, which is an Eton society for senior prefects, of which he was a member, as a self-electing elite of almost sickening pomposity and arrogance, with a belligerent disregard for the rest of humanity. That description from Johnson, that defies traditional class stereotypes, which were formerly epitomized by the noble aristocrat willing to sacrifice it all for king and country. Taken their place have been the working classes, the key workers who kept the country running during the pandemic, who are the ones guided by patriotic altruism in the modern age. One thing that has always shown that the English ruling class are morally fairly sound is that in time of war, they are ready enough to get themselves killed. That's what George Orwell wrote during the Blitz. And Simon Cooper backs up that idea in Chums. He notes the fact that 7 Oxford Union presidents died during the First World War and 3 during the Second. But this spirit has evaporated, at least among our current flock of aristocrats in public life. Though Johnson thought of himself as a Churchillian leader and wrote a bad biography of the former wartime prime minister, Johnson himself instinctively clung to self-interest over the public interest, even in his final days in Downing Street. Part of the reason, though, that Johnson was able to persuade us that he embodied the Make Britain Great Again philosophy was because he embodied the past. He was, and he still is, the Bertie Wooster of Westminster. Johnson and his political allies, they embodied this old aristocratic sense of privilege, but crucially, alongside an abandonment of old aristocratic ideals of public service. This, potentially could be due to an imperial mindset that is cultivated at ancient private schools and universities. Cooper suggests that the history and the architecture of Oxford produces an obsession with the past and a misplaced assumption that the British state and state of mind is more powerful than it actually is. This is potentially why the likes of Johnson are obsessed with power. They want to reinvigorate the age of empire, with them ruling the world. But this anti-meritocratic moment is not down to the aristocracy, the old English aristocracy alone. The 1980s and 1990s, as I say, presented a moment of crisis for the old aristocracy. Its institutional power was declining. This happened both through the Conservative Party and through the private school system, which felt like a beleaguered form of schooling, as says Richard Beard in Sad Little Men. In 1982, Beard says, 2 years after David Cameron left Eton, his prep school closed down despite impeccable upper-class credentials. This was a frightening prospect for the aristocracy of potential social and political irrelevance. And it led them to search for new allies abroad, welcoming the spoils of oligarchy into their businesses, their political parties, and ultimately their schools. In exchange, and it was a two-way process, these international oligarchs are coated with the veneer of respectability that comes with an intimate relationship with the world's most pompous aristocracy. The reputations of oligarchs are fortified in the private members' clubs of Mayfair, while their money is sanitized in the luxury high-rises of Canary Wharf and safely stored in London's property market. In all this, Britain, as those who've read Butler to the World will know, Britain is the fixer, using the tools that it evolved during the colonial era to hide illicit wealth, both offshore and onshore, and in return taking a cut of the proceeds. And there's been no more brazen example of how Britain has been flogged to an international elite than the government's approach to international investment visas. So while right-wing politicians have lamented a supposed invasion of asylum seekers into Britain, the UK, on the other hand, has allowed oligarchs to buy access to our country with minimal security checks. Established in the 1990s following the breakup of the Soviet Union, the government operated a golden visa scheme for people promising to invest millions in the UK. If granted an investor visa, the individual in question was allowed to live and work in the UK for roughly 3 years. And from 2010, the decade from 2010 to 2020, 12,000 individuals were offered investment visas on this basis. What's more, participation in the scheme allowed those individuals to gain permanent settlement in the UK after just 5 years. And in exchange for investing more money, these individuals were allowed to speed up their permanent settlement application, becoming eligible for settlement after 3 years in exchange for 5 million, or just 2 years if they pledged to invest 10 million, often with minimal checks about where that money had derived from. So from 2010 to 2020, nearly 3,000 of the investors were granted permanent settlement in the UK, with 2,000 of these coming from the government's list of countries where we are particularly concerned about human rights issues. In total, 2,300 Russians were granted golden visas and 750 were awarded permanent settlement status in the UK. So I think this all shows that Britain's marriage with illicit finance is not a new thing, and it's especially not in its capital, London. London was described in the 2020 nearly suppressed Russia report by Parliament's Security and Intelligence Committee as Londongrad, a place in which PR firms, charities, political interests, academia, and cultural institutions are all beneficiaries of Russian money. There are some 140,000 offshore-owned properties in England and Wales. 100,000 of these are registered as residential, with almost half located in the capital, in London. The average value of an offshore home is a cool £1.3 million, which means that they are collectively worth 56 billion. So 56 billion pounds worth of offshore property. And to a large extent, Britain no longer owns the landmarks that are so closely associated with the capital and the country. Battersea Power Station is now one of London's largest property developments, converted into more than 4,000 flats, with most of the luxury flats sold off plan long before they were completed. The power station itself was sold to the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund and the Employees Provident Fund of Malaysia for £1.6 billion in 2019. The Shard, which is the tallest freestanding structure in London and the second tallest in the country, is owned by the Gulf state of Qatar, which is now the 10th largest landowner in the UK. The Gherkin, another phallic structure in the capital, is owned by a Brazilian conglomerate, and the walkie-talkie, its neighbour, is owned by a Hong Kong company best known for its Chinese-style food sources. City Hall, which now formerly housed the Mayor of London and the promenade around it, is entirely owned by Kuwait. And private schools have been caught in the updraft of this surge of new money from the East. As Mark Hollingsworth and Stuart Lansley write in their book about Londongrad, private schools deployed marketing teams to Russia from the 1990s onwards, hoping to attract an influx of oligarch sprogs. This effort, as they document, was largely successful. One former pupil saying that the British Airways flights were like school buses filled with unruly Russian children commuting between their English public school and their Russian home. Now, as we have seen, sadly, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, these oligarchs are stubbornly lodged in British society. They're embedded in our institutions, political, cultural, and corporate, through which, as I mentioned earlier, they store their money and clean their reputations. In some extreme cases, they've even donated sums to political parties, and they've even landed spots on the comfy red benches of the House of Lords. As the Russia report said, several members of the Russian elite who are closely linked to Putin are identified as being involved with charitable and/or political organizations in the UK, having donated to political parties with a public profile which positions them to assist Russian influence operations. This is a security report from Parliament. The report also goes on to say that it's notable that a number of members of the House of Lords have business interests linked to Russia or work directly for major Russian companies linked to the Russian state. So, bringing it back to the central idea, the new and old elite have merged, leaving little respect for British traditions or values, or really anything aside from the robotic expansion of assets. The old elite, in its case, is acting through desperate self-preservation, hoping to capture some of the spoils of oligarchy to resist the meritocratic tide. The oligarchs, for their part, they're just happy to exploit a country that acts as a safe haven for their cash, governed by a legal system that persecutes journalists for saying mean things about the wealthy, and with long established links to offshore tax havens. And this is the makeup, currently, the old and the new, of the Bullingdon Club elite. It's not the quaint, benevolent leadership of Disraelian aristocrats, but a calculated alliance of old and new money dedicated towards ruthlessly extending its own life opportunities. And this whole merger has been facilitated by a democracy with intentionally weak safeguards built on the social standards of the past. The rules of British democracy have been built on the idea that our leaders belong to that paternal, benign bourgeoisie, what constitutional historian Peter Hennessy has called the good chaps theory of government. There is no need for checks and balances on their power, such as is the case in America, for example, because our morally superior leaders are governed, supposedly, by higher laws. Take the ministerial code, for example, which is supposed to be the moral handbook for the cabinet, and it's underpinned by the Nolan principles of public life: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. But breaches of the code, and in fact the contents of the code itself, are adjudicated by the Prime Minister. What's more, the Prime Minister's application and behaviour under the code is overseen by an ethics advisor who serves at the behest of the Prime Minister. Freedom of information legislation, something that I'm deeply concerned about, which requires public bodies to release information within the public interest when they're asked to do so, is frequently abused by major government departments. And there's evidence that fewer and fewer freedom of information requests are actually being responded to with substantial evidence in recent years. Public regulators, the likes of Ofcom, Ofgem, ACOBA, which regulates post-ministerial jobs, these are themselves notoriously toothless and mired in cronyism. So, taken as a whole, the agencies of democracy and the agents themselves who are installed to uphold morality, probity, transparency are often fig leaves. They are individuals appointed by the administration whose loyalty is primarily to the party and the government, not the democratic system. And the epicenter of this democratic deceit is Parliament itself, where in the House of Commons, a Prime Minister can lie with impunity while those who accuse him or her of deceit are ejected from the chamber, as Labour MP Dawn Butler was in July 2021. This system also allows unfettered access to private firms and their lobbyists. From 2019 to 2022, MPs earned £17 million from private sector jobs. Of this figure, 15.2 million was earned by Conservative MPs. Former Prime Ministers, meanwhile, so Blair, Cameron, May, Johnson being the worst culprit, have collectively earned tens of millions of pounds after leaving office, merely by virtue of them having resided in 10 Downing Street. And once this conveyor belt starts whirring, once self-interested individuals see similar people running the country and earning millions of pounds, regardless of their performance in office, that conveyor belt is difficult to stop. As Dominic Cummings has said, our current political and media environment encourages more of the narcissists to get involved as a sort of low-grade alternative to being a celebrity. Ultimately, our current political mess is a story of self-interest winning over the public interest, but it's also a story of how Britain's democratic structures, and particularly in Westminster, exclusively in Westminster, have allowed this to happen. In many ways, the same form of wealth extraction used to exploit our former colonies have now been turned inwards, used by a small band of people to extract wealth domestically. And our political and economic structures have been left exposed to this political moment. The question going forward is therefore one of national culture, for sure, whether we can stop spewing out little Bullingdon boys and worshipping their superficial champagne charm. But it's also a practical political question, whether our democracy can be reformed to stop us from being further ransacked by a rootless, increasingly lawless elite. That job is no mean feat. It's going to require bold, capable, quick, radical change, tapping into the decency of the British public and their rightful indignation with the status quo. Ultimately, from my point of view, I think it's time that Britain was once again seen as a nation, a curious, beguiling blend of regions, nations, accents, classes, and cultures, all with a stake in our collective prosperity, rather than what Britain is currently, which is essentially a corporation owned and controlled by a few all-powerful shareholders. And that should be the guiding mission of the next government. And with that, I'm more than happy to take questions.
That was amazing. Thank you very much indeed, Sam. This is the bit where we need to have a big round of applause from the 162 people here, but in fact, we get kind of silence. Do grab a glass of water. I hope that's water. We have some good questions in here. I'd actually like to add, I think that reflected very well on my teaching. Although, of course, when we did we did our module, Boris was sort of pretty in the background. It's that long ago.
God, I know. Tell me about it. I know he was still mayor of London, actually.
He was still mayor of London. Yeah. There'd been no Brexit. We'd had been the Scottish devolution referendum, but that was about as exciting as it got.
As tasty as it got.
Yeah, yeah. It's all happened since then. Right. I'm going to group some of these questions together. We've got a nice array of interesting questions from Malta, questions from fans of your work. Okay, I'm going to. Is there a Cambridge version of the Bullingdon Club? And I think with that, we'll also take, do you think the Bullingdon Club will ever accept women?
Oh, good question. I'm not sure I'm one to answer questions on what the Bullingdon Club will or won't do. As you can probably tell by my accent.
Not a member.
I wouldn't necessarily be the top of the scouts list for membership. Interestingly, I'm probably going to Oxford later this year to talk to the Labour Society about the book. So I'll be very interested to hear their reflections on how well they think it reflects the university in the current day and the nature of the elite. So perhaps I can report back after that. I mean, the fundamental thing for me is that, yes, Oxford's important, but it's important as an analogy for British society and also British universities. I mean, something that I wrote extensively about in Fortress London was the elitism that occurs at lots of British institutions, higher educational institutions, sadly. I documented the case of Durham University, where there is a lot of discrimination against northern students, bizarrely, considering that Durham's one of the most northern universities in terms of the north of England that you can get, and a lot of discrimination against working class people at Durham University. And I think, that is equally the case at Cambridge and, particularly the case at Oxford and, those high ranking institutions. But I think this plays into the sort of class hierarchies that we still have in this country, and also a sense that that's acceptable, that there is sort of a superior ruling elite who are allowed to behave, if not like Bullingdon Club members, but kind of like Bullingdon Club members, and belittle people for being different social classes. And we're very much stuck in a 20th or even 19th century attitude towards class and regional discrimination in this country. So yeah, elitism is everywhere that you can find in institutions of power in this country, and at most major Russell Group universities.
Yes, I'll spare you my Durham stories about a march in support of raising student fees. Okay, I'm going to ask the Malta question from Rosa. How does the situation in the UK compare to that in other countries? We have seen similar tactics here in Malta, developers and a handful of big businesses in cahoots with politicians. And she then thanks you for the talk. So is Britain, is your argument that Britain is a more sort of intensified version of these developments in capital?
Yeah, I think definitely. It's certainly not an exclusive problem to the UK by any means. I think that, as I described with the whole London grad stuff, The UK is perfectly positioned. I mean, in terms of the sort of intersection of time across the globe, like you can trade in London with the East and the West very easily. So that means innately you're going to have a lot of capital concentrated in the City of London. Combined with that, a history of empire and, like I say, an offshore entities that are validated by the British legal system, and you stir that in with a British aristocracy that has basically not had to relinquish power to any great degree in recent history. Maybe during the later stages of the 20th century, and I'm sure you may agree or disagree with me on that one, Lawrence, but essentially over recent history, it hasn't had to relinquish that much power. And so when you stir in those factors, you stir in the sort of economic and the social conditions to let elitism thrive, and you're going to get a pretty, and as I say in the first book, a concentration of economic power in one city, which means that it's very easy to invest in a profitable way in the luxury property sector. You're going to get a real problem. And I mean, it's interesting. I went to Groningen in northeast Netherlands last year to do a talk, and that's northeast Netherlands is one of the poorest regions of the country, and I was staggered by the quality of social housing. I was staggered by the green developments that had taken place in the city. I was struck by how much of even the most expensive property is locally owned and is not just an investment opportunity for people. And in fact, how effectively public-private partnerships work in the city, because there is a balance between the state's power and the power of private interests. It seems as though in this country, private interests hold vast power. And, I'm not Liz Truss's biggest fan, as people may well imagine, but I think that she did have a point that the markets do run the country. And I do think that they have a large influence over whether a government is successful and whether a particular prime minister is even selected or not. I mean, 40% of the Conservative Party's donations come from the financial sector. So when you have that sort of private sector dominance as you do in the UK, you're going to get a pretty explosive, toxic situation.
Yes, you can't buck the markets, as somebody said. Right. I'm going to take some more sort of domestic politics questions. This, I guess, is partly the sort of depiction of Johnson and the culture wars bit of the chapter in the book. Why was Johnson able then to mobilise working class voters in the 2019 election? And I'm going to add, if you like, the sort of historical question which Peter has asked: is in what ways is the situation worse? Is it the 24-hour news cycle, the internet? Is it in fact that things are now more transparent than they were, or is this a sort of shift in those class structures and class power?
Yeah, it's interesting. Take the first one first. I think the whole Johnson, phenomenon in terms of like how he managed to do that, coming from an old Etonian former Bullingdon Club background and becoming the man of the red wall, is, I mean, it's bizarre, baffling. My theory on it is that Johnson cut across class backgrounds purposefully, intentionally, and he did it well with the use of humour. He was always, despite being this kind of establishment figure, he was always seen as a bit outside the establishment. He was never really accepted within the Conservative Party establishment itself. He was always at war with Cameron. He was always getting sacked. He was always having an affair. And so as a result, he was seen as like this rogue, this lovable rogue who was seen a lot more than other politicians. He went on, "Have I got news for you?" He was seen as a cultural figure a lot more than a political figure. And as a result, when people had that, my talk or my book talks a lot about the justifiable anger that lots of people have with the system. And so when that came bubbling to the surface through Brexit, and then, you know, had a channel through a general election in 2019, people saw Johnson as this guy, this sort of wrecking ball, this blonde wrecking ball who could go down to Westminster and mess. You know, he wasn't your clean cut politician like Starmer or Sunak. They saw someone who could actually, you know, represent their interest in quite a direct way. And I think that was part of his downfall, is that once that pact was broken, once people saw that he was the same as the rest, he was the same as, you know, he broke his promises in the same way that Clegg did, the same way that Blair did, obviously in a different way, through partying and through breaking the rules through coronavirus. Once that pact had been broken, that's finally when it snapped in the minds of voters. And I think that's the reason why there's no comeback on the cards for Johnson, because he's now one of them. He's one of those politicians who's lied to us, and he'll stay that way. There's nothing that he can do to change that attitude in the British public's mind. I think on the second question about why this is worse, I think a big part of it has to do with like a political and cultural alignment, a purposeful alignment between America and the UK. Obviously, its roots are long-standing, like the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Tufton Street groups that I write a lot about, you know, to this day. They have their roots in sort of, you know, middle 20th century, you know, a few of them, you know, spanning then later towards Thatcher's era of government. But the way in which they have been successful and the communication of ideas from one side of the Atlantic, so the culture war has sort of spawned in America, and then a hell of a lot of money and good political organization on the part of the right has then filtered that across the Atlantic to the UK. And that has been a really purposeful thing that big money interests on both sides of the Atlantic have tried to achieve. And that's been put on steroids by, yes, the social media environment that we currently see. That exchange of ideas is a lot more possible. I think Trump as well sort of just opened the floodgates to allow people to realize that you can say what you want and it probably won't hit you, precisely because there's so much noise in the modern media agenda that, you know, the next day there's going to be a different scandal and another scandal and another scandal. I think Steve Bannon calls it flooding the zone with excrement. And that's entirely the strategy that populists have, is flooding the pitch with as many stories as possible to confuse the opposition. And Trump showed them like how that was possible and the limits that they can get away with. And the problem now is how do you put it back in the box? It's out now. It's like unleashed on the world. So that's, yeah, it's a frightening prospect.
Yeah. Yes, the book is good on that, actually, the kind of Trump, Brexit, Bannon, Farage method of politics. Right, we've done that one. I'm going to keep Rob's as the closing question because I think that's quite clever. So I'm going to group a few more together and then we might let you take a rest in a second. So I've got Barbara's question. How do we get round this? Would PR be of use? Andy has added, sort of asking, is the royal family part of the blockage there, kind of high end of the aristocracy? Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the monarchy is an interesting one. I think they're kind of like the sharp end of the spear, so to speak. They sort of epitomize a lot of the elitism, but also the sycophancy that I talk about. You know, this sort of innate, built-in social deference that we have in this country that makes us believe that people with posh accents are just geniuses, even when they're talking complete nonsense. And the royal family is very much like the kind of beacon of that attitude, sadly. I mean, one thing that we haven't really talked about, which I think is a big part of this, is the media, and that intersects with the royal family quite heavily, in the sense that the media is often born from these same social cliques, and the sort of Westminster cabal system of the Westminster lobby, which is basically the political reporters who are allowed access to power, as in they can literally go into the Houses of Parliament and chat with politicians and go to the same bars and that sort of thing. That sort of incubates a system of like, oh, we've got to protect our own. We're all part of this clique. We can't, pull back the veil on the wrongdoing that's happening, because the media would actually be implicated in all this. And Partygate showed that, if the full array of stories had emerged about Partygate, notoriously there were journalists involved in those parties. In Boris's flat, for example, there were parties in big media establishments. I think they've been reported by Private Eye, if you want to go look them up. So it's the case that they're all swimming in the same sort of polluted waters. Would PR help? I think, would PR help? Yes. I think PR would help primarily because you would politics is currently orientated in the favor of the Conservative Party because it doesn't have much competition on the right. Also, the electorate is just, aging in a particular way that means that, those who turn out to vote are instinctively more inclined to the Conservatives. And I think, if nothing else, PR would help to rebalance the political coefficient towards a more fair reflection of views in this country, and allow for that balance of Green and Liberal and centre-left Labour thought to be properly accommodated. Again, I mean, obviously lots of European countries have PR, and the argument against it is that you have the extreme elements, the people on the far right of politics, actually integrated within the political system, as in they're more likely to gain seats because it's a lower bar to election. So you probably would have seen the likes of UKIP gaining quite a number of seats at its high point. I think, having spoken to people in Europe about this, they seem to say that it cauterizes them to some extent by folding them into the political system. It kind of allows them not to be seen as like these rogue outsiders who are, banging at the doors of the establishment. They become part of the establishment at that point, and they have to become part of the solution potentially. And so it allows you more effectively to ignore them by having them as, representatives in Parliament. But then it does also run the risk of them actually, entering government at some stage. So it is a tricky balance, but I'd say on the whole, PR would probably improve the political climate in this country.
Right, yes. Watch this space. Labour doesn't have a great track record on that. It is interesting. I do think there is something in your point about the sort of, our deference to received BBC and sort of posh languages. I'm now writing about the early 80s, the Sloane Ranger handbook, which arguably is sort of the beginnings of some of this. Right, I'm going to take one more question. Sorry to everyone. There are some really good questions. There is a question about sort of, comparative European political elites in there. But I'm going to ask Rob's question because it sort of speaks to some of the other questions are about why there isn't more political anger or action about this. Rob is a fan. How does your research in this not keep you permanently livid?
It does. That's what keeps you going. No, I mean, I'm pretty consistently asked this question, and my answer always is, I think there've actually been massive political strides made in recent years as a result of this anger, and that might be surprising, but I'm really heartened by the fact that a band of outsiders on the progressive wing of the media, mainly independent publications or campaign groups, managed to expose some pretty hefty scandals in the name of corruption, the PPE crisis, which I've written about extensively. The Good Law Project has done amazing work on all that. Partygate, abuses at the top of power, the revolving door between private sector and public sector, etc., has actually pushed Labour to some pretty decent economic positions, particularly where the Green New Deal is concerned. So I think they've actually been, knocked Boris Johnson off the throne, got rid of one Bullingdon boy, so we can only take that as a big win. So actually there have been some good political successes where, and I know the left has done its typical thing of fighting with each other, but there's been a pretty big degree of unity, like a quite exceptional degree of unity, I'd say, in left standards in the past few years. There's obviously been rightful concerns about the way in which the left of the Labour Party has been treated in certain circumstances, which have been exposed in the past few days again. But I think generally, from the sort of anti-Brexit left to the Novara left, there's been a real push in the same direction to expose the way in which politics and economics is working badly in this country. And ultimately that will probably bear fruit in a general election result next year that we can't complain too much about. So yeah, I think if that wasn't the case, I'd definitely be, crying into my breakfast. But there are some reasons to be cheerful.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting, because that does go back to that question about, hasn't it always been like this, East India Company kind of question. But yeah, and I noticed that Starmer today not only stuck to the Green economic plan, but also said that there'd been much more scrutiny on government contracts, which speaks to what you've been, the sort of PPE.
Definitely. Labour's scandals. Most radical on constitutional reform, which plays into regional inequalities, which is great, which plays into devolution, and fundamentally plays into the questions that I was talking about at the end about democratic reform. And that's a success that lots of people on the left can hold up as their own, which is great.
Good, great. Thank you very much indeed, Sam. Just a couple of messages before we end. The recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. And you will be contacted by email when the video is available to view. And if you would like to purchase a copy of Sam's book, I've already got it. It will be available from the festival's partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And more information on this can also be found on the festival website, or head to foxlanebooks.co.uk, where you'll be able to buy it again. Sam, thank you very much. Congratulations on the book. And we'll look forward to seeing what you produce next. And thank you very much to the, I think at peak we were about 165 of you who came along. I hope it was enlightening, and we'll call time there.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Great. Thanks, Sam.